Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Robotyne, where we see that the Ukrainian forces are fighting here in the western parts of Robotyne, trying to push against the Russian forces in the area and capture some of the trenches the Russians have prepared in their defensive lines here by the Zaporizhzhia region. We also see the Russians counterattacking in the eastern parts of Robotyne, northwest of Verbove. This is all reports according to Deep State map, where we see that they have changed the front line to be moved in favor of the Ukrainian forces here west of Robotyne, where they managed to capture this forest line here and some of the trenches the Russian forces have in the area. We also see the Russian advances here to the northwest of Verbove, where we see that they managed to capture this forest line here and managed to push back the Ukrainian forces, negating some of the recent advances they made a couple of weeks ago. We then move on to the next point, which is the Staromayorsk area, where here again, according to Deep State map, the Russian forces managed to advance and capture this first line here. As we see on the map by Deep State map, we see that the Russian forces managed to advance here on the eastern parts of Priotne, west of Staromayorsk. This allows them to now pressure Staromayorsk from the western parts. As we see, Staromayorsk is located here next to the river line. With that, the connection the Ukrainians have with their own forces and fortifications are to the north with Avdiivka and to the east with Urushaine across the river line. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are likely looking to advance here to the west of Staromayorsk and try to cut off this road here that goes to Staromayorsk, which is one of the two supply lines. Cutting that off will allow them to push towards Staromayorsk from the northern parts, and then cutting it off, the Ukrainian forces have one supply line to Urushaine here from the northern parts, and with the Russian positions here in the eastern parts of Urushaine, which Deep State Maps reports that the Russian forces have lost control over this area. However, my map and according to Syriac maps, they still have control over this area, and whether or not they have is a very important deal, because if the Russians have control over this, they can launch an attack towards the north of Urushaine here as well, and with this pincer maneuver, they can attack Staromayorsk and Urushaine at the same time by cutting off their supply lines and sieging them down. Meanwhile, if the Russian forces do not have control over this, they are forced to then take control over it before they can start doing so, which may set into question why are they launching attacks towards Staromayorsk. Is it to redeploy the Ukrainian forces from Urushaine towards Staromayorsk, trying to get them advantage there so that they can push here in the northeastern parts? Or is it because they are just trying to pressure Staromayorsk and the supply lines to try and grind down the Ukrainian forces in the area and not trying to capture the villages? We then move on to the current star of the show, which is Avdiivka, where we see that the Russian forces managed to advance here to the northwest of Krasnoyarivka by the rail lines, and we see that they managed to advance from their currently held positions, both in a western direction and in a northern direction, towards the village of Novokalinove. So we are now seeing pressure towards this village, which is essentially the Ukrainian base here to the north of the area. We see that they hold as a connection between the eastern and western parts. If the Russian forces capture this area, there's no connection between the Konstantinivka area here to the east, Turetsk and so on, with these western roads. There's only this one small road and the railways. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces have this as a dual village in a high ground area looking down over the southern parts by the railways. So the Russian forces would have a really hard time trying to capture this, as the Ukrainian forces have heavy fortifications in the area and have geographical advantages. However, here in the western parts by the railways, with the current Russian advances, we see that they're moving further westwards as well, which will allow them to then pressure the forest patch area here southeast of Ocherytne, which is this village here to the northwest, which is another big village in favor of the Ukrainian forces with fortifications and geographical advantages. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are likely going to make an arch here, trying to capture the connection between the two railway lines between the east and the south. If they manage to do so, they'll be able to cut off the main areas here, and they'll likely not advance further until they actually manage to capture Avdiivka. This is likely be their defensive line here in the northwestern parts, or we could also see them looking something like this, where they try to capture the southern forest lines here south of Novokalinove, and then down here to the forest lines here, and then cut it off. And talking about this area, we see that the Ukrainian forces managed to recapture some territory here. This shows that they are actively trying to push the Russian forces back and cancel their attacks here towards the Pove, which is contested by both sides right now, as Russian forces continue to pressure the Ukrainian forces in the area. We see that the fighting also continues here, it's further south by the rail lines, where the Russian forces are trying to pass over and storm the coke plant. They've so far been unable to reach it, and is now fighting by the railways here in the northeastern parts of it. We also see that the Russian forces continue to pressure here in the eastern parts, and in the southeastern parts, where the fighting continues in the industrial area, where the Russian forces managed to capture most of it. And when I say Russian forces, it is the combination of former Wagner fighters together with DPR units and other Russian soldiers associated with the Ahmed units. So it is the Russian forces mostly associated with industrial fighting and urban fighting throughout this war. The Chechen fighters have been fighting in Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and Lysychansk, while the Wagner fighters have been fighting a lot of places really, but mostly known for the Battle of Bakhmut, and with the DPR fighters being generally involved with the Avdiivka area, they know this area better than anyone else in the Russian army. So with that, all of this combined, they have the most advantage here in the southern parts. And what is the significance of these southern parts? If we take a look at this topographic map, this area here, this is all Avdiivka, and if we take a look at the southern parts which the Russian forces are currently fighting at, we see that these are all located at higher grounds than the northern parts. We see here 246 compared to the area here with 189, so somewhere around 70 to 80 meter difference in the elevation. These are all the forest areas which are located here in the southern parts of Avdiivka. We have the residential zones here, and then the main city zone in the Avdiivka area. So we see that most of Avdiivka is actually located in somewhat middle place with the high ground, somewhere around 226, 220 to 30 meter elevation compared to the 260 meter elevation by the forest lines. With that knowledge, it becomes fairly easy to split up Avdiivka into multiple parts. We have the main area, which is the residential zones within the city, and then these are located at the middle heights, somewhere around 220 to 230 elevation. We have the sub-elevation residential areas, which are located at the low grounds, which are the most vulnerable. We have the citadel area, which is the high-rise area of Avdiivka, where the Ukrainian forces are mostly concentrated with their overhead view due to the heights of the buildings all over the open fields here to the southwest. Then we have the open areas to the east of Avdiivka. We have the dachas areas here to the north, which are the vacation homes, and then we have the coke plant here to the west, and then we have the industrial zone here west of Avdiivka. So with this, we see that there are multiple parts, and what we're currently seeing the Russians fighting is the coke plant here in the northwest, the dacha areas here in the northern parts. The open fields are mostly left unnoticed, and then we have the southern parts, which are elevated. They are at the highest elevations in Avdiivka. It overlooks the whole city, and then we have the forest lines and so on, which gives good cover for the infantry when they're not facing off against thermite bombs or TOS systems. The citadel area itself has largely been a target of Russian heavy artillery and bomb strikes, as well as air strikes, missile strikes, and so on. And then the main residential area will most likely be subject to what the Russians did similarly in the Bakhmut fight, where they just stormed it building by building. With the Wagner forces returning to this part of the front line, they're able to essentially just do what they did in Bakhmut here in Avdiivka. So with that, we see that the Russian forces are doing this with different tactics at an operational stage at every single part of the city according to what is happening. In the Dacha area here in the northeast, there are reports of fighting, and the Russian forces seem to be focusing here on the northern parts rather than the eastern parts, as there is this disconnection between the river line here in between, and this western parts has the high ground over the eastern parts. So if the Russian forces pressure the northern parts, the Ukrainians will likely retreat out of the eastern parts and then pour their troops here into western parts to strengthen the defenses here, leaving the eastern parts vulnerable and open for a Russian attack, but they will still be on the low ground, so the Russian forces would be under constant fire from the Ukrainian forces on the western parts. But if there is pressure on the eastern side and on the northern side, it will likely just be a matter of time before it falls. So with that, we see that the Ukrainian forces are being heavily pressured within the city itself. And as for the flanks, we see that there's continuous pressure on Stepove, and then we are likely to see further attacks from Vodiane towards Severne here in the southern parts. And if the Russian forces also start pressuring the flanks, similarly to what they did in Bakhmut, the Ukrainians would end up with their final supply line here in the central part. If the Russian forces capture the coke plant, there will be no major and significant supply lines in and out of Avdiivka, and it will just be a chokehold by the Russian forces on the Ukrainian defenders within the city. And with the lack of supplies sent by Western nations to Ukraine, it becomes more and more difficult for them to orchestrate a counterattack similar to what they did in Bakhmut, and this will make it much more catastrophic for the Ukrainians defending Avdiivka than Bakhmut ever was, because the Ukrainians would have a more difficult time with less experienced soldiers that were used up in the offensive operations, and with less equipment, supplies, ammunition, and so on, with the lack of supply from Western nations. So it all seems like a repeat from the Battle of Bakhmut, just with a better advantage for the Russian forces compared to back then, because this is a combination of multiple forces, but also with more experience and more equipment, with the Ukrainians having less experience and less equipment. And as for the Bakhmut direction, we see that the Russian forces managed to recapture the territories in two directions. First, in the direction of Avdiivka, we see that they managed to capture half of the village while the other half is contested. And as we saw with the pictures from a long time ago, the village is completely destroyed. There's essentially nothing standing. Therefore, we can say that whatever there is under Russian control and contested, while there's really nothing else there, just open fields, which means that the Ukrainian forces here in the forest lines take positions here will be pressured by that due to the lack of supply lines going to and from that area. So the Russians will most likely push the Ukrainians out of the forest line here and then move on to the northern parts as well. And with that, they will recapture the whole railway here to the east of Klishivka. And with that, the Russian forces will likely start pressuring Klishivka here to the north more, trying to recapture the fortified position north of Klishivka, and then cutting off the rest of the Ukrainian forces on the western parts of Klishivka, and then moving down to capture the canal line like they had before. So we are seeing that the Russian forces are now having the initiative and pushing the Ukrainians back here to the southern flank of Bakhmut, the same with the northern flank of Bakhmut, and with that they would be cutting off and destroying and recapturing all of the territories the Ukrainians took throughout the 6-month-long offensive that they had take place between May and November. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.